Beside the shimmering waters of Sydney Harbor, a clown face beckons with promises of thrills and laughter. Its crown of lights is a beacon drawing families to the waiting amusements beneath the dark cloak of a night sky. But there beyond the gates of Luna Park lies a wound that dares not heal. A dark and angry scar from the night in July of 1979 when 7 souls would be carried into silence forever by terrific greed cloaked in flames and smoke. But the fire did not end when the smoke cleared. It would smolder within suppressed evidence and whispered accusations muffled beneath the weight of corruption for more than 40 years. Eventually, the web of deceit eroded with time, revealing a truth that turned this fire from a mere tragedy into the betrayal of an entire nation's trust. From the ashes, the ghosts of the past cried out with the truth of corruption and concealment in obedience to a man so desperate to serve his own greed that he would sacrifice innocent lives to feed the gaping maw of evil in his heart. The Luna Park Ghost Train isn't just the story of a fire. It's the story of what happens when evil prevails, distorting worth in the hearts of men, causing them to turn away from truth to obtain that which the evil covets, money and power. Make no mistake, the 7 lives lost that night at Luna Park were in sacrifice to the greed of a man turned monster. The evil in his soul was so pervasive that it allowed him to cloak a legion of slaves in the uniforms of cops and seat them at the desks of politicians. If all of the allegations are true, then Abe Saffron killed 7 people in order to benefit his real estate portfolio. Greed is nothing more than the perverted delusion of a corrupted soul tricked into believing that money and power can fill the void created when they sacrifice their own humanity to serve an unworthy master. Greed killed 7 people and silenced the truth for over 40 years. Can the wrongs of 4 decades ago be overturned? Will there ever be true justice for the families of the Luna Park victims? Let's talk about it now on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer and former firefighter.
And I'm Ranger Flint Bisonhorn, broadcasting live from a decommissioned missile silo under the Badlands, where the coffee's black, the humor's darker, and the fire never goes out.
Please remember to follow us on social media, including X, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. We were delighted to be featured this week by Podbean on social media, so if you see that post, drop a like on it to tell Podbean that you're listening and help us kick open some more doors to grow our audience. As always, we're so very appreciative if you would like, comment on, and share content you see from us, and don't forget we're also on YouTube and you can subscribe to us there. If you would be so generous as to leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen, that is a huge help. Keep in mind those platforms that do allow individual episode comments like Podbean, Good Pods, and Spotify. They also use those comments to determine how engaged our audience is with the podcast, and so those comments can also help drive traffic towards us.
Not actual traffic, right?
Right.
I don't want cars
virtual
into
traffic.
our house.
So if you would just go and leave us a comment, and if you can't think of something to say, just tell us what your pet's name is. Or if you don't have a pet, tell us what color your shirt is. I don't care. Literally anything.
What did you name your wiener?
Don't tell me that. Don't want to know that one. Check out our spread shop in the show notes. There are some discounts going on now until April 17th. So get on that and plaster our logo on your body in return for our undying affection.
It's not.
As always, send us feedback, your fire stories, and case suggestions to crimetoburn@gmail.com. And also be sure to follow the podcast Ruddle Me This with New Zealand comedian Taylor Ruddle, because in the upcoming weeks we will be on his show, and I will let you know the exact date when I have it. Also, you can tune in to From Dirt We Grow on Tuesday the 15th to hear us talk with host Stephanie about wrongful arson convictions resulting from junk science that was taught to fire investigators for far too long. Okay, we have had 2 weeks to discuss this fire. We've covered the fire itself, the eyewitness accounts, the police investigation, the suppression of witness statements, the destruction of evidence when the scene was cleared less than 24 hours after the fire. We discussed a bit about the reasons this fire was so deadly, The fire inspectors telling the owners that the ride was a fire hazard and needed a sprinkler system, and of course the requirements for today's special amusement buildings intended to keep another tragedy like this from happening. We've also discussed the resulting investigation that called the fire an electrical fire and then changed tact to say it was accidental from a cigarette when the electrical engineer refuted the electrical fire theory at the coroner's inquest. We've also talked about the group of bikies present at the park that night and witnesses that overheard them talking about starting a fire with kerosene, and the eyewitnesses that smelled kerosene in the ride. And then we started talking about the allegations that this was all an elaborate plan by Abe Saffron, aka Mr. Sin.
Mr. Sin.
Now, it was well known that Abe Saffron always wanted to get his hands on Luna Park. He saw it as a very valuable piece of undeveloped real estate right on Sydney Harbor, across from the Central Business District and the Opera House, and he fully intended to get his hands on it. So he is alleged to have paid these bikies to set the fire in order to force the government to call for tenders on the lease, because this land was crown land, meaning it was leased out by the government to developers. And the company that won the tender was none other than Abe Saffron's cousin's company. In addition, Jack Rooklyn, an infamous underworld criminal in the Sydney crime scene, was very close to Abe Saffron, and his daughter told the mother of one of the boys that was killed that her father had told her and her friends they could not go to the park that night to meet the boys because something big was going on and it was going to be too dangerous. We also learned that in the 80s, Abe Saffron was alleged to have been involved in several arson fires, all using kerosene and all intended to further his real estate aspirations in the King's Cross area of Sydney. And finally, we heard claims from a member of Saffron's inner circle that confirmed that the corrupt police officials we talked about were all friends of Abe's and that he entertained them regularly.
What was the name of his real estate company? Kerosene Williams?
I don't know. Finally, in the mid-'80s, when rumors of Abe's involvement in the tender for Luna Park became a bit too hot to ignore, there was an investigation to see if Saffron had a financial stake in the company that won the tender. And that's when those family connections were uncovered, proving a very obvious connection. But despite this evidence, the investigation report says that they found no credible evidence of Abe's involvement in the company, proving that either the investigators were either really, really bad at their job or they did the investigation with their eyes closed.
Now, I suspect when you're saying Tinder, you don't mean the dating app.
No, Tinder is the word in Australia for that they use for like leasing. The land was up for lease; they put it up for tender. That's what they say.
Like legal tender,
I guess.
Is that?
I didn't dig into the origins of the word in Australia. I just needed to understand what it meant.
But can you say it with an authentic Australian accent?
No, I can't do any accents. You know this about me.
Tinder.
I'll lean on you for all my accents.
You should.
Okay. But the corruption allegations don't end there. We have more to go. But before we do, let's talk about circumstantial evidence again. Remember that circumstantial evidence doesn't prove a fact is true. It only points to the idea that something could be true, but it stops short of being proof. And circumstantial evidence, at least here in the United States, is usually heavily challenged in court by attorneys. However, circumstantial evidence is permitted, and ultimately in the United States at least, it's up to a jury to determine if it's believable or not. When we have a preponderance of evidence all pointing to the same potential fact that may be true, it makes it a lot more believable and can push us into saying that something may not be provable, but it is probably true. When we don't have a preponderance of evidence that all points toward the same conclusion, then we can only say that something is possibly true at best, but we can't say that it's probable. Now, to me, the phone call from Jack Rooklyn's daughter to Mrs. Carroll, the mother of one of the victims, saying that her dad had said something was going down that night at the park, along with the obvious and glaring connections between Saffron and the entertainment company that won the tender for Luna Park, along with all of the supposed witness statements, that's enough for my meter to swing toward probably true for most of these allegations that we've already talked about, including the fact that the investigation was botched intentionally and that this was a ploy by Abe to get his hands on Luna Park. However, there are some allegations put forth where my meter doesn't swing out of the possible but not probable range. And we're getting into those today, and this one is a little bit of a hot take. Now, many, including the journalists that made the documentary on this fire called Exposed the Ghost Train Fire, which is on Netflix, These people have asserted that the corruption doesn't just stop at the cops. It goes all the way to the highest levels of government, including Premier Neville Wran. And I will explain what a premier is for those of you in the US in just a second, but hang with me. The accusations against Neville Wran are not as convincing to me as the allegations that Abe Saffron could have ordered the hit on the ghost train to improve his real estate holdings. In fact, I had a bit of trouble following the web of deceit that allegedly led to Wran, but I got it hammered out in my head, and I'm presenting these ideas to you so that you can decide what you believe. Me personally, I think the involvement of Neville Wran is a possible but not probable situation. However, I don't know Wran's entire political history, and I don't know a lot about Sydney politics, so take my opinions with a grain of salt. Many others think it's not only probable, but that he was definitely involved. And there have been some really outspoken press on the topic indicating that the links to Neville Wran were overblown in the documentary, which was released in 2021. So I'm going to share the theory with you, but definitely check into the sources in the show notes for other perspectives, including many dissenting opinions. Now, for those of us that don't live in Australia, we need to understand the political structure to understand what the premier is. We don't have that position in the United States, but as I understand it, and feel free to send me an email correction if I get this wrong, the premier is the head of the government for a state. Now, they also have a position called a governor, but the governor apparently represents the monarch, and they're appointed by the monarch on the advice of the premier, and the governor's role is largely ceremonial, leaving most of the executive power to the premier. So the premier is the head of government and the leader of the governing political party. So how is this different from that of a governor in the United States? Well, in the United States, the governor is the head of the state and the head of government for the state. So the premier is the head of government in Australia, but the head of the state is held by the monarch-appointed governor.
Wait, did you say two governors?
Yeah, in the United States, our governor does both the roles of the governor and the premier in Australia. So we have governor of the United States.
So when the governor here goes to Australia, he takes away a job.
Not quite.
That's what I heard.
Okay, I'm going to let you live in that delusion. Now, I didn't dig into how they divide the duties exactly between the premier and the governor, but it sounds to me like the premier is the more powerful position, so feel free to email me if I got any of that wrong.
So the governor's the bottom and the premier's the top?
No, the governor is largely ceremonial. So basically, the premier is similar to our governors here in the United States, but he shares the duties of state with another person that they call governor. Now, at the time of the fire, the premier in New South Wales, which is the state where Sydney is located, was a man named Neville Wran. Now, Neville isn't alive anymore, but while he was premier, he had a lot of controversy surrounding him, not the least of which included a lot of allegations of corruption. Many allegations of corruption. And this combined with the fact that there were such high-up officials in the police department, like the commissioner, that were obviously corrupt. And it just seems like for that to fly for as long as it did, there had to have been some support of the corruption at even higher and higher levels. And maybe there was. The theory presented in the Ghost Train documentary I referenced in the show notes is that Neville Wran was an associate of Abe Saffron, and he was definitely involved in helping dear old Abe serve the greed monster inside him by helping to get the award for the tender of Luna Park. You see, immediately after the fire, the park closed down. So since it's Crown land, that means it's up to the government to award the lease, which they did, to Abe Saffron's cousins. In this company that Abe Saffron's cousins ran, their CEO was the trustee for all of Abe Saffron's money, making a pretty definitive and clear connection between Saffron and the park tender. So what evidence do we have to support this theory that Saffron had Neville Wran in his pocket? Well, it's a pretty tangled web. But in the mid-1980s, Australian police were investigating allegations of organized crime within the police force, and by my count, this is several years too late, but I guess better late than never. Now, at some point, they got all into the spycraft stuff that they heard that the FBI was using over here in the States, and they wanted to follow suit. So they tapped some phones and recorded the conversations and then had officers type up transcripts from all of the recorded conversations. Now, 2 of the people that were involved in that investigation are still alive, and both of them state that there was proof in those recordings that Rand was talking on the phone to someone about helping Saffron win the tender at Luna Park. If it's there in black and white in transcripts, why do I only say it's only possible and not probable? And the answer is that these tapes and transcripts no longer exist. You see, when they first came out, Neville Rand told the press that they were fabricated. But that's not all he told them. He told them that the cops that made the recordings had illegally wiretapped these phones, and not only should they all be fired, but they should be jailed for taking illegal activities under their belt. Now, this investigation wasn't actually an investigation on Rand. It was focused on a high court judge. But the Neville Rand conversations were apparently a bonus because he was an associate of this judge. But before the investigation concluded, this high court judge got terminally ill and died. And so the investigation stopped right there, and it never went any further. I guess it's less fun to prosecute a dead guy. And we don't know if this is the result of more corrupt cops or if this was all 100% out of fear, but the investigators involved in these wiretaps then destroyed the tapes and shredded the transcripts of the calls, and that included the Neville Rand calls. So we do have witnesses that swear Neville Rand admitted in those illegally taped calls that he was involved in helping Saffron win the lease. Now, I was thinking about why this allegation feels a little shakier to me, and definitely the fact that the investigation stalled and the tapes were destroyed makes it feel like there had to have been something to hide. Or why would they destroy the tapes? And in the face of potential jail time and or being fired, where a cop could lose things like their pensions, it makes sense to me that they might have been pretty easy to convince that the destruction of these tapes and transcripts would be beneficial to their long-term livelihoods. Now keep in mind, I'm summarizing the link here, but you can go and check out Exposed: The Ghost Train Fire on Netflix for a deeper dive into these allegations. If these allegations are true, it makes some of the more confusing parts of the case a little more understandable. Remember how that inquest into determining whether or not Saffron had ties to the company that was operating Luna Park after the lease was tendered? That investigation found no evidence of a connection, even though the connection was obviously not hard to find. Remember last week I showed you a clip of that guy? He was one of the people responsible for that investigation, and he looked like super uncomfortable when he was being questioned, how they could have missed such a big and clear connection. Well, if those people were being pressured by Neville Rand to report a different conclusion, it makes more sense to me why they may have been looking the other way when the elephant entered the room. Now, many have criticized the alleged connection to Neville Rand, but I understand how they got there, and while I do think that the circumstantial evidence tying Rand to the Luna Park tender is weaker than the evidence we uncovered about the cops that intentionally covered up the fire by botching the investigation, I think it's still a valid theory, and there are enough witnesses attesting to this theory that I think it was right of them to include it. But I do have some criticisms about their coverage of the fire itself in the documentary. Now, they talked about how Sue Manning saw the flames initially at the little fire vignette, and she held out her hand toward the flames and felt the heat and marveled at how real the effect was. Now, kerosene is a volatile liquid, and to me it seemed odd that there would have been such a small fire in such a logical location if it started from kerosene, unless it was just a little kerosene. And it's possible that it was just a little kerosene, because how do you smuggle a big drum or a tank of kerosene onto a ride? It would have been seen, so it must have been small.
How are they smuggling any amount of kerosene on this ride? Who smuggles kerosene anywhere?
I'm assuming that since they were going on the ride with the intention, allegedly, of setting the ride on fire, that they put some kerosene in a little bottle, like a
genie bottle.
Well, I was thinking like a lighter fluid type bottle, you could squeeze it. Then as the documentary continues, the statements from the eyewitnesses talk about this explosion they witnessed as the fire grew, and it exploded out of the doors of the ride. And there are actually photos of this moment. Now, the witnesses in the documentary appear to be describing this. It's their intent for us to believe that this was no normal fire fueled by ordinary combustibles. And I think one of them even says something to that effect, that it just wasn't a normal fire. And so it felt like to me that they were saying that there had to be some kind of accelerant present to cause this kind of big explosion. However, looking at the photos and considering the construction of the ride, which was basically all wood and flammable decor, this looks to me like flashover, which can and will often look exactly like an explosion. And in a way, it sort of is. In a small confined space, flashover, which is where all the fuels are off-gassing, they're vapors, and suddenly all of those vapors in the air combust at once. It looks like the air and smoke and everything catches fire. It can create sort of an explosive bursting of flames out of the building. And we saw this just this week. There was a video that went viral of a flashover at a house where a firefighter was standing on the porch, and the flashover was so violent that the porch roof collapsed onto the firefighter. I don't know if you guys saw that. So I wish the documentary makers had called in a fire expert to explain that this is what happens during flashover. This is likely just flashover and not an indication that somebody would have had to smuggle some huge quantity of kerosene into the building to blow it up.
Especially in their butt.
Nobody said anything about smuggling kerosene in their butt. And while I do believe it's absolutely possible, probable even, that Abe Saffron paid some bike gang members to start the fire, and they did, I also recognize that we can't prove this. We have the circumstantial evidence of 2 witnesses, and actually a third has come forward apparently after the documentary aired, that all claim that they smelled kerosene that night.
That's enough for the Old Testament.
We have multiple witnesses that say the fire started in the area immediately after the cage where the little fire scene was. And we have Sue Manning to say that there were flames in that area when she went through that section of the ride before the fire was reported. And we have 7 witnesses that saw bikies that night. Actually, we now have 10 because 3 more have come forward since the documentary aired. But only one of them specifically heard one of the bikies talking about kerosene and lighting the fire. And that probably wouldn't be enough to sway me into probable from possible. But once you add in that phone call from Jack Rookland's daughter to Miss Carol explaining how she'd not been allowed to go to the park that night because her dad told her something bad was happening and it was too dangerous, that was the piece of evidence that made it a lot more believable to me. And then once we find out that Abe Saffron did actually have a hand in the company that won the tender, it gets even more plausible for me. However, in order to conduct a proper fire investigation, we have to rule out all the other possible causes of the fire, and based on witness statements, there's at least one we cannot rule out. What if a fan in that fire vignette stopped working, and some of those streamers that were normally blowing upwards, instead of blowing upwards, had fallen over onto a light and got hot and ignited? That could absolutely explain the small flames and the heat that Sue Manning experienced when she went through the ride. But it doesn't explain the kerosene smell that some reported.
That's what I was going to say. What about the kerosene?
But we can rule out an electrical fire because the electrical box was in pristine condition, and based on witness statements, there was no fire in any of the area of electrical equipment when the fire first began, and the electrical engineer that examined the photos of the electrical boxes after the fire at the inquest said there was no chance this was an electrical fire. And we can also rule out that it was caused by a cigarette because 0 people that were on the ride recall anyone smoking or recall smelling cigarette smoke. So that leaves us with either intentional arson or an accidental malfunction of one of the effects. So what we would then do is take samples and test them for kerosene. But we can't do that because Inspector Douglas Knight and his alleged cronies had the scene destroyed the day after the fire, completely obliterating any chances that anyone could ever get any evidence either to support or refute these arson claims. So even with all the circumstantial evidence, we can't rule out an accidental cause unless someone with insider knowledge comes forward. And someone did. Allegedly. In May of 2007, after Abe Saffron died, his very own niece, Anne Buckingham, told the Sydney Morning Herald in an interview, indirectly, that her uncle was responsible for the fire, but claims that no one was supposed to die in the fire. And this makes sense because Saffron was linked to 7 other fires in the early 80s. So the interview went something like this. They were discussing her uncle, and she was explaining that he liked to collect things, and Luna Park was one of the things that he had always intended to get his hands on for his collection. So the reporter then asks if she knew the identity of the person that started the fire, and she apparently got silent, then laughed nervously, and then said that fire was a strange thing, but no one was meant to die. However, at the time she gave this interview, she was contesting her uncle's will after his death, and she later called the Sydney Morning Herald and demanded afterward that they not publish her statements because it could hurt her case. Then she sent a letter denying that she'd said those words, but unfortunately for her, this was a taped interview, so they have it on tape. But something else that the Herald reported was that according to the park owner at the time of the fire, it was a man named Leon Fink, and he told the Herald that his lease had already expired. It had been up, and he had been trying desperately to get a new lease in place. He had even appealed all the way up the chain to Premier Neville Wran. Now, to me, this is interesting, because recall that fire inspectors had recommended a sprinkler system which Fink had not installed. And because it had been a year since they gave him the recommendation to take some steps to make the ride safer, they finally stepped in and gave him a limit of 12 months to get it done, just 4 weeks before the fire.
Isn't it interesting that his name is Fink? Hold on, I'll give you a definitive value. An unpleasant or contemptible person. Inform on to the authorities. There was no shortage of people willing to think on their neighbors.
Okay, then that is ironic that his name is Fink.
Failed to do something promised or expected because of a lack of courage or commitment. Administration officials had finked out. I think it's appropriate.
So if Fink wasn't sure that he'd be able to retain the lease to the land, of course he wasn't going to spend money on a sprinkler system until he got that lease in place. Otherwise he could be spending money on something that he was going to have to tear out of there. And then of course there's some more esoteric theories of the fire that I don't personally put any weight on, but I'm going to mention them for the benefit of being unbiased, if not a little unhinged. One of the last photos taken of Jenny Godson's son earlier on the day of the fire was taken across from the park at a festival that was going on in Sydney. Now there are apparently people dressed in all manner of costume, and one of the costumed parade goers is a man in a horned mask. Now to me, this just looks like a fairly poor Halloween costume.
The QAnon shaman's creepy uncle.
But some people's tinfoil hats may need adjusting because they assert that this horned man is dressed like some kind of demon. The most common suggestion is that he's dressed like Molech.
What? The Molech?
Mm-hmm.
The ancient god that people fed their children to?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. In fact, my next sentence is, a demon that demands sacrifice with the preferred sacrificial format of burned children. And if you Google Molech, some artists do depict him as a man with a cow's head and horns, or man's body with a cow's head and horns. But that isn't the only way he's ever depicted.
He's also depicted as tossing the office of Nancy Pelosi.
But some people claim that the fact that Jenny's son was pictured with him means that this guy was at the park, and because the park didn't employ costumed actors for parades like this, and because nobody's ever been able to identify this guy, that he was actually some sort of demon claiming the Godson children because their names were literally Godson.
What the
And because reportedly right before attending the park, the boys from Waverly College had all gone to mass together.
This is like people who take Lovecraft works as canon.
However, what this theory is lacking is a little bit of extra knowledge and common sense, because this photo was not taken inside Luna Park. It was taken across the harbor at a festival that was going on, and apparently the festival had a lot of actors in costumes doing traditional dance and stuff like that. And while I do think there was some evil happening at Luna Park, I think it was evil in worship of money and not necessarily some sort of bodybuilder in a Fred Flintstone loincloth with a DIY mask demanding child sacrifices and some sort of ancient Canaanite pagan ritual.
Yeah, but the way that you just put that, now it makes sense why they would think that.
And it annoys me that so many people say this picture was taken in the park, because you can literally look at the photo and see that's not the case. It was a festival, and behind them there are no rides or park games or food stands. It's all high-rises.
Just devils with erections.
So with all the evidence, what do I think? I think Abe Saffron is responsible, and I leave it to you to decide what you think. And I think it's possible that Neville Wran was at the top of the chain of corruption, and that maybe he did have some small role in helping Saffron get the tender for the park after the fire. However, I don't think there will ever be enough evidence to prove that the fire was arson unless one of the bikies or someone that knew one of them comes forward.
Bikers, bikies, doesn't matter. Any of you will do.
Now, one person did get interviewed in the documentary with his identity concealed and his voice changed, but it was impossible to parse what he was saying. But you could tell from the context clues from what the reporter was questioning him that he was alleging that he had knowledge that Abe Saffron had ordered the fire. But without knowing who he is, I have a hard time putting a lot of weight into that. Now, ultimately, after the fire, there was an inquisition to see if the owners of the park would be criminally liable for the fire. And the inquest found that while they did fail to fulfill their duty in providing a safe ride, it wasn't enough to warrant criminal negligence, so they were never held criminally liable. After the fire, Luna Park closed for a while. And then the new lease was tendered, and proposals were submitted to redevelop the land. Remember, that's what Abe Saffron wanted to do with the land. It was a very valuable piece of land. And some of the plans that were floated included luxury apartments, office buildings, and I even read that at one point they entertained the idea of an adult entertainment establishment on the site.
Hot.
However, these proposals, all of them, received very swift backlash and triggered a swarm of lawsuits because the people of Sydney didn't want to lose their nostalgic theme park. So ultimately, the park was eventually leased to another group where it was massively renovated and reopened. And it's been closed and reopened and closed and reopened, but it still sits there today, and it's now a protected heritage site, and you can go to Luna Park today and enjoy some of their newer modern rides and reportedly also a beer.
Really?
Well, I Googled it and I found like Reddit type of board. It wasn't actually on Reddit, where somebody said, yeah, you can get a beer at Luna Park or you can bring your own.
New bucket list item.
So if that's not correct, please somebody correct us before we buy our tickets.
Yeah, dude, because I'm going to be super disappointed. And you don't want a pissed off American in an Australian theme park with no beer.
And now, in 2025, there is actually a chance that we might one day get to see some movement in this case. Because at the end of 2024, a new inquest into the case began. And as a result, they deemed that it was proper to start an investigation into the handling of the investigation of the fire, and that was ordered last October. And as of this recording in April of 2025, there's no new information to report. So at this point, no one's been held responsible for the fire, no one's ever been found liable, and thanks to Detective Douglas Knight and his buddy Bill Allen, the commissioner, there was no evidence collected that could ever prove one way or another if kerosene was present. So I'll doubt we'll ever get real clarity on whether the fire was accidental or intentional. All the evidence is circumstantial, but there is a preponderance of it to point toward Abe Saffron. As for whether or not the corruption can be proven to touch the premier, I think it's possible, but I'm stopping short of saying probable. Now, Tony Carroll was the father of 12-year-old victim Richard Carroll, and he still mourns his son, misses him terribly. And I want to close with a quote from him. He said, quote, "We believe that carrying anger and hate against anyone responsible for his death will only end up being destructive to the rest of our family. While we do not believe Mr. Saffron was a good man, we bear him no ill will." And that's our coverage of this Sydney Ghost Train fire on Crime to Burn. Join us next week for a brand new case, and don't forget to leave us those comments, ratings, and reviews. Can I get a little zoomy zoom zoom?
This week we're going to try to break the Dakota barrier. The South Dakota barrier. But look how far away your spit guard is.
I'm the engineer of fiery things, not soundy things. But why are you dressed as a bush?
This is the Spring Ghillie collection. I'm modeling it today.
I see you even tricked out the microphone stand.
Yeah, well, I wanted to be matchy-matchy. You don't want to be some kind of Johnny-come-lately with a bare microphone stand when you're going full ghillie. You could use echolocation.
What kind of noise do bats make when they use echolocation? Do they like squeal?
I can't even hear it. I don't know.
Or is that a dolphin?
That's probably it. It's probably like a flying dolphin. Bats and dolphins are genetically adjacent.
Nature's jazz hands. They're so cute.
They are adorable.
If they weren't so bitey and prone to rabies.
I've never been bitten by a bat. That's some alliteration. Those guys are diabolical.
Pick which
Was
one?
that your womanly instinct to stay quiet kicking in? I adore that. That is delicious. Always in the kitchen, no shoes, little apron, little bow in your hair.
This describes me never.
Making me muffins.
I asked her about this and she said, I don't like having a sock on my right foot, which was ironic because at the time I asked her, she had a sock on her right foot and not her left foot.
You just want to wear one sock? There's no way that's a hill I'm willing to die on. Like, you just wear one sock. Who cares?
I remember jams.
Well, these were like the originators of jams. I think they started the whole jam-elution.
We can't have you yelling in the podcast.
Is that yelling? They got like one awkward pocket, and it definitely doesn't highlight your junk. And you're listening to the only podcast endorsed by a jackalope. I'm just hoping that South Dakota tunes in and wonders where we've been all their lives. Well, that's my part of the whole thing, and now I'll just take a nap while you ramble. We already talked about this, but I feel like I should address the elephant in the room. The reason I'm dressed like this, Brian, is because I don't want the people that listen to us to be able to see me today.
You owe me silence. I gave you eggs.
You're being held hostage by a freaking feline.
I mean...
You're bad at this game.
Oh, so bad.
We're never going to a sports bar together.
Why?
We'll lose at trivia.
There's only one animal on Earth that lives on land for its entire life but breathes through gills.
The donkey.
No.
What the f***? Did someone just ask me what caliber my ghillie suit is?
A Halligan bar is the firefighter's forcible entry tool.
It sounds like a potential case for...
I
don't like it.
Was it all about the bass, or?
I think it could have had more bass, honestly. Yeah.
So it's about treble.
Yeah, treble farts. Yeah. What's that about? Like, who are you? What are you doing? Like, I appreciate that, like, you've kept it toned. At some point, you just want to rumble the mountain, you know, and just make your presence known, even though they can't see you because you're totally in a ghillie suit. This is how Bigfoot legends get started.
A guy in a
You're
ghillie
out
suit
there,
farts.
you've had too much dairy. Oh, great. 5 guys on a high-protein diet in an elevator.
No, I'm not really a save myself from mental anguish kind of person.
You're really not. You're a true crime podcaster. You're a sick freak. That's what you are.
Pretty much.
I don't even know how you sleep at night. I think I just silently threw up in my mouth. I suppose there are other people with fear of jail because of their names. Any dude named Nancy.
We passed the Coming River of Life Church.
That's right. That is real.
That is real.
When I was conceived, my mother lived in Flippin, Arkansas. And in that town, there are several things. Like, there's a dollar store, there's a Walmart, there's a Church of Christ. So you got the Flippin' Church of Christ, you got the Flippin' Walmart, you got the Flippin' whatever. I saw it. It wasn't very impressive, but it was a...
I don't feel like I need to watch this.
What does it mean? What is it when your family tree looks like a wreath?
Inbreeding.
But that's stuff normally reserved for royalty. So don't turn your nose up at it. Look, if it ain't good enough for family, it ain't good enough for anybody else.
Like that.
I said hilarious. My psychiatrist says I'm not crazy. Well, he doesn't say anything anymore. He's dead, but he did totally say I wasn't crazy before not like right before he died, but like way before he died. And I had nothing to do with that.
He was an awesome man, even if he was a little narcoleptic.
But he was such a good psychiatrist that I was willing to overlook the chronic narcolepsy. And in some ways, I'm still there, wandering the bush.
You want me to helicopter in and pick you up?
Can you helicopter?
No, I can learn. You can learn anything from YouTube.
I thought you had to have a wiener to helicopter.
Not that kind of helicopter. I meant like with an actual helicopter. Which, speaking of tragedies...
Well, I feel like a human turd. Let's move along. I'm still not your friend. You want to be friends? I'm starting to see some hearts around your butt. Do you know in Minecraft, whenever you go to...
breed?
I was going to say something like attempt to coerce your pixelated farm friends into fornicating.
Okay, that works.
These little hearts will appear around their butts, and then bink, a little baby thing appears. Boop, magically, just spontaneously manifests.
Yep. So we were in the movie, and my daughter leans over to me. There's a scene where the pandas manifest a baby into existence. Little hearts swirling around, and she leans over to me and she goes, "That's accurate."
She was there to observe the deviations from the Minecraft canon.
And eat popcorn.
And eat a lot of popcorn. Holy crap. I've never seen 3 people eat that much popcorn. Not like I had a bit, like no kidding, but...
I did too. We went through
we crushed some popcorn.
Large popcorns with 3 people, and she ate 80% of it.
It was just constantly in the popcorn bucket. Did you know you can bring beer to the zoo?
You're hung on your nut.
Everyone knows that. And the zoo security descends upon us. We appreciate what you're doing here with the beer. Please buy some merchandise at the Monkey Hut. How delightful. A wine and roller coaster. This sounds like a great afternoon.
And I almost killed a bear.
I'm sorry, what?
But the guy I was with said something snarky, and I threw the ball at his face, expecting him to catch it.
I like your chutzpah.
He didn't catch it, and it bounced off his face into the bear enclosure. And all of a sudden, all of the bears that had been ignoring everyone suddenly were more interested than anything, and there was 0 zookeepers around. Running around.
There's nothing as grumpy as an impacted bear.
But we finally found a security guard outside the zoo area, and I told the security guard what happened. And he goes, "And?"
This is unacceptable bear behavior.
And I got to touch a Clydesdale.
Where'd you touch it?
Where would you touch it?
I touch it everywhere.
Maybe I did get a little too poetic with this.
Gaping maw of evil in his heart. That's awesome.
All right, I'm going to just keep going.
Damn. My heart will eat your face.
I got a little poetic. It was 3 a.m., man.
And I'm a guy who says words and stuff.
Please remember to follow.
Money. Hashtag money. You can't see me because I look like a tree.
When we have a preponderance of dogs, I have to pause here to tell you that I mistyped this, and it said that's enough for my member to swing towards.
Well, that's odd that you should say that, because when you were talking about that, I was wondering what it would look like if your member was swinging.
Did I said meter, right, and not member?
I know, but I heard member.
I said meter, right? I didn't say swing my member.
I don't know, but now when you say meter with your member, you see what I'm thinking?
I almost said I'm picking up what you're stepping in.
What the f***'s happening?
I'm picking up what you're stepping in. I'm smelling what you're putting down. It's put forth where my meter...
Is that like a job description? Right through the zipper.
And we're getting into... Oh, man. I said we're getting into hose today.
Hell yeah.
Is for those of you... Damn it.
Goo? Those of goo.
Those of goo.
Will know the truth. Where's my Vegemite? That's not a podcast. This is a podcast. And too much gravity makes the whiteboard fall on the floor. I've done this a lot. Without my time machine, which is missing a vital component that I cannot find locally. Like, I'm the personification of landscaping now. I do feel a little bushed. I'm still lost in the woods. I am an invisible bush in a gigantic forest.
And this combined with the fact that they were such...
Dickheads.
How that inquest into
indigence?
Yep.
Balls and sack.
Balls.
Elephant. They didn't criticize that elephant. They were like in all of it. No one notices until he whips it out.
I learned an interesting story this week.
That reminds you of that?
I heard a story that one of the Beatles, Paul McCartney, was charged with arson for lighting a condom on fire in a club one time.
Did it stick?
No, he was just...
No, I mean the condom.
He nailed it to a wall and lit it on fire.
So it definitely stuck. No. The charges did is he like a convicted arsonist, Paul McCartney?
He was kicked out of Germany when it happened.
The whole country of Germany? Paul McCartney, my goodness, you're my new hero. Ribbed for her pleasure. I can't wait to get back to kerosene. It's like hemorrhoid surgery. Puberty will do that to you.
Will only end up being destructive to the rest of our family.
In this couch.
Say something to sign us off.
Something to sign us off.
Love a good mystery that leaves you wanting more? Check out my podcast. Hi, I'm Kadra, the host of Perplexity, a Mystery Podcast. I tell tales every single week that have left me perplexed. You'll hear true crime cases, mysterious disappearances, learn about cults, hear baffling sightings of cryptids, chilling paranormal encounters, and even dark and weird history. I release new episodes every Wednesday, and you can listen anywhere podcasts are available. I'm also on Patreon, and you can even watch me on YouTube. Perplexity, a Mystery Podcast. Stories that will leave you perplexed.